With Saklamandre now crowned Sarvan of Scythia, and the Dyrg Vaarza finally at an end, Scythia finally rejoined the world as an active force, aligned in this age towards conquest. But first, Saklamandre had to get his realm in order. Indeed, for several years he focused on rebuilding the realms of his former rivals and building working relationships with the surviving members of the families he put in charge of their now distinct cultural region. The Rizvidites of the Caucasus were the most prosperous, seeing as they surrendered to the now victorious Agarids, and many of their learned men were put in charge of rebuilding the country. Some regions, however, with more unsavory regional cultures, underwent forced re-Scythianization, namely in Opali and Menadite lands, one for its savagery and the other for its Greek xenophilia. While this process went on, the world continued its march through history. In June of 701, Armenia chose war, eschewing the path of Christ, and marched against Rhodes. The surprise attack was swift and devastating, especially in the Anatolian lands belonging to Rhodes. The Armenians also refused to offer the same temple sanctuary to Christian churches that was usually customary to religious buildings during wartime, burning them to the ground, commoners and clergy within. There were almost instant signs of unrest as riots broke out across Armenia. But, unless a major noble converted in secret, Armenia had a chance to handle the situation and even come out on top. This soon proved not to be the case, as only a couple of years later, not only did Rhodes prove hard to fight when they were in their guard, but also a high-ranking noble, Prince Farron Arantid, of the royal house itself, raised his flag in rebellion against the crown, both as a claimant and as a Christian. This was a conflict that would lead to Armenia's invasion of Rhodes failing, and would consume the country in near-constant civil war for years to come. By 710, war had spread across Europe, with Pieria and Hellas locked in one of their many wars, and the Snake Eaters of Savacia defending against a holy crusade from Santonia, known by history as the First Crusade, as well as a general invasion from Swabia. But further east, the time of Scythian conquest finally arrived. They were united, and the outward expansions were quick and easy. First was the Slavic tribe of Abria, overcome in a relative moment, the war lasting barely a month. Indeed, their chief, Slavidovich, as his people's only fortress burned in a pile of great smoldering timbers behind him, stood naked before it with a broad axe, challenging Saklamandre himself. As the still air filled with the sound of arrow strings drawn taut, Saklamandre had them stood down. He removed his gleaming helmet, his layers of lamellar armor, and with his hair across his back, he drew an axe of his own, and accepted the challenge of a chief now more savage than him. The two traded blows fiercely but briefly, as Saklamandre, young and adept, soon delivered a fatal blow to his stomach, its contents spilling over the defeated chief's naked legs. He then beheaded him so as to cut short his suffering. He took this brave man's broad axe and burned his body, and the axe of Slavidovich would be something he carried with him north, against his great conquests of the Slavs, which would be his life's work. Elsewhere, the mountain people of Armistia, sheepskin cloaks thrown over their backs, were attempting to curry the favor of Hellas now by engaging in battle with Pieria. Many likened this to currying the favor of the lion by pestering the wolf. Time would tell if this would pay off. Further west, Vasconia was busying itself with matters of war against the Celts of Iberia, namely against Neria. In 711, Saklamandre fathered his first son and heir, named Kandravasu Agarid. In 712, the tribal chief of Chernigov attempted to lead an invasion force consisting of several combined tribal armies, but they were dashed, and a portion of his lands taken from him as a result. In 714, under intense pressure from the Santonians to the west and Swabians to the east, the last chief of Treveria, Duxtir, took his own life, hanging himself by a tree, leaving no heir. The sacred grove pretended he lived for yet 3 weeks, but his body was soon discovered, and panic shot through the country, the war chiefs divvying it up amongst themselves. In 714, Scythia struck out east against their fellow Scythians in the Dahe, contesting land on the edge of the Rin Desert. This turned out to be much more of an involved conflict than was initially intended, the two sharing such similar strategies and motives to the point that the battlefield became decidedly confusing. One defining feature of the Dahe, however, was their Buddhist iconography, given that the Shakyamuni was popular in Dahe, and they held that he, too, was a Scythian. Regardless, there weren't many sieges, but instead a litany of fast-paced, wide-open steppe battles in which these defining characteristics were necessary. Saklamandre himself commanded these battles from his mobile field encampments, as did the Dahe. Eventually, it came down to a battle of the chiefs again in 716, with Baro Sarvan Saklamandre Agarid XVII and Sarvan Anghatna Namzark II engaged in single combat. The two stood far apart from one another, stationary, and made use of huge, heavy bows, couched in the ground at their feet, to fire long arrows at each other. Whoever moved first, or died, was considered as having lost the duel, and he, or his surviving second, would submit to the demands of his rival. This was the way of the Dahe. Great arrows littered the earth, and Saklamandre suffered a grievous wound in his side, but one of his arrows struck true and gored Anghatna through the eye, killing him instantly. The day was won, and the Dahe surrendered their land in the west. Still, Saklamandre's crippling wound shredded many of the muscles in his flank, and made him reticent to accept any more challenges for personal duel. In 718, the unrest in Armenia came to an end, with the Armenian crown surrendering the territory of Paphlagonia to the Christians for their own kingdom. In 720, Scythia conquered the remains of Chernigov alongside a portion of Karachev. It was at this point that various ethnically non-Slavic tribals of the north began to capitulate and request vassalization. Between 722 and 745, Chuvashia, Itil, and the Pechenegs were all vassalized, each one of a Turkic or otherwise Asiatic extraction. During this time, the remainder of Karachev was also conquered, but then conquest calmed down for a while, since Scythia was expanding so rapidly, and time needed to be taken in order to properly administer the realm. He shuffled around new courtiers, assigned titles to his men, and enforced cultural norms upon the new foreigners which now were under his protection, especially the Turkic peoples, who proved disobedient and shifty, and required constant reminders of their place as guests and supplicants to the protection of the Scythian people. In 747, another son was born to Saklamandre, who he named Sankhar Sarme. In 751, the Middle East saw drastic generational changes with the collapse of the ancient Seleucid Empire. Under Basileus Andromenes Seleucid, a rather absent and decadent monarch, the Seleucid Empire suffered a war on all fronts. The Islamic forces of Gerha and Amrame launched a combined invasion north, while the Zoroastrians of Parthia, under Emperor Tudal Megalid, invaded south, utilizing tactics copied one for one from the famed conquerors of Scythia, whom Tudal personally admired. Bereft of any and all friends in the region, the venerable residue of Alexander's great empire was finally eroded, as generals deserted and the people fled. By the end of the year, the entire region had been divided, with Parthia claiming the lion's share, and Gerha, in a close second, proclaiming the Nogahi Caliphate. The Muslims of the south and west nonetheless maligned the Parthians as so-called fire worshippers for their Zoroastrian faith, but these insults fell on deaf ears, as a young, ambitious new empire turned its sights west with designs to conquer Armenia and replace Scythia.